my grandmother was a wonderful person. She taught me how to play the game Monopoly. She understood that the name of the game is to acquire. She would accumulate everything she could, and eventually she became the master of the board. And eventually, every time, she would take my last dollar, and I would quit in utter defeat. And then she would always say the same thing to me. She'd look at me and she'd say, "One day, you'll learn to play the game." One summer, I played Monopoly with a neighbor almost every day, all day long. And that summer, I learned to play the game. I came to understand the only way to win is to make a total commitment to acquisition. I came to understand that money and possessions, that's the way that you keep score. And by the end of that summer, I was more ruthless than my grandmother. I was ready to bend the rules if I had to win that game. And I sat down with her to play that fall. I took everything she had. I destroyed her financially and psychologically. I watched her give her last dollar and quit in utter defeat. And then she had one more thing to teach me. Then she said, "Now it all goes back in the box. All those houses and hotels, all the railroads and utility companies, all that property and all that wonderful money. Now it all goes back in the box. None of it was really yours. Houses and cars, titles and clothes, bulging portfolios, even your body. Because the fact is that everything I clutch and consume and hoard is going to go back in the box, and I'm going to lose it all." You have to ask yourself, when you finally get the ultimate promotion, when you made the ultimate purchase, when you buy the ultimate home, when you have stored up financial security and climbed the ladder of success to the highest rung you can possibly climb it, and the thrill wears off, and it will wear off, then what? How far do you have to walk down that road before you see where it leads? Surely you understand, it'll never be enough. So you have to ask yourself the question, what matters?
Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to you. My name is McLeish, and welcome to the 23rd of November radio show for the Zeitgeist Movement Global. This is the first in 3 lectures, which are jokingly and half seriously designed to form our answer to the Christmas lectures that we see in Britain. They were thought of originally just quite simply to round off the year with a general summary broken down into individual topics and into individual focuses in order to sort of take stock of the year and take stock of our experiences over the last 12 months. They've been a very interesting 12 months. A lot of stuff's happened. And so I thought it would be very useful to cover 3 broad topics and focus again, double down again on our materials. The first one, which is today's lecture, is called What is Corruption? And we'll essentially focus on how to interpret global events and the logic of the society we live in to understand what the phrase corruption means, not just how it's used within a society, but what it actually denotes. The second, which is going to be a little bit more light-hearted than that, is called Art in a Resource-Based Economy, and touches on something that we've never really explored to a great extent before, and that would be what would be possible in an artistic and creative sense within an economy, within a civilization that has maximized technological efficiency, has deliberately sought to bring the abilities of human beings to the fore. What might be possible? Of course, it'll be a limited scope because I only have so much time, and because, of course, we still do live in a society that has maybe blunted our imagination with regard to what is actually possible. But nevertheless, we're going to give it a go just as a thought exercise, just to see what we are gunning for, and that it's not just all about cold science and all the rest of it, that we really are advocating something that is more human than the broadly unhuman system that we have now. And the third one will be on control. This is something we have almost, this is something that we've dealt with before, but I think does require, 30, 40, maybe 50 minutes of continuous dissection. And that is the idea of a resource-based economy, any model of government that is deliberate, when it's, any model of resource allocation and coherence of action by a collective people. How that can be something other than totalitarianism and all the rest of it. A lot of people say, well, aren't you just advocating a move from one form of government or one form of control to another? So that lecture is going to deal with what is control, what kind of control are we talking about? Can we maybe understand control in something other than deliberate coercion and purely negative terms? So that will be the third in the lectures. They'll be spaced out throughout December. They're not going to be one after another in order to make sure that we have plenty of other people on the show. But let's get to it, and here's this week's one, which is what is corruption? So 2011 has been a year of riots and protests. For the first time, we've seen global protests about roughly the same issues. No longer a mere class or countries in a state of uprising. Whole continents are raising their heads and their fists, and we can no longer divide East and West as the powerful Middle Eastern Arab Spring pits modernity and the prospect of global citizenship against the established order of its corrupt dictators. And in the West, the Occupy movement, with over 2,000 encampments in the Western nations, makes it clear to the Anglo-American arena that pan-national resistance can and has been forged to oppose the general order, not just single country and single issue politics. Both movements look to each other for and with inspiration and some recognition, perhaps the first time that East and West have regarded each other as something other than points on a compass whose simple up, down, left and right directions, known as north, south, east and west, don't really reflect anymore the true nature of what it means to live on a globe where, in fact, there are no borders and every direction ultimately leads right around in a circle. This, too, is the two-dimensional thinking in a three-dimensional reality that we have spoken about before, and that really lays out some of the groundwork in how we're thinking at the moment. And yet, destructive riots bolted onto originally non-violent protests in the UK, which happened a few months ago. Italy, as well, which has seen riots in Rome and damage against people and property. Continuing riots now in Syria, resulting in civilian deaths as the government cracked down. And many other areas where this kind of bent against the protesters started happening. A few days ago, we even had, UC Davis. There was a policeman at UC Davis who openly pepper sprayed 20 or 30 students constantly with a 0.7 solution of pepper spray, which is very high. That's what they use on bears. So we've seen proper violence breaking out in this as well. And that has coloured the public perception and fed the media their required scandal-flavoured images and biases. The Occupy movement or any of those movements, despite their tenacity and inventiveness, none has credibly made an argument during, for example, the Occupy's BBC appearances, and thus it does risk dismissal, even if they are entirely justified in their resistance to an evidently unjust and inefficient system that wastes both natural and human resources. Perhaps it is, for the first time in history, a very real possibility that we, humanity, are considering our issues on a table the size of the world, and that the next paradigm shift will have to serve us collectively in a coordinated fashion. Or we may face an arguably overdue eradication to claim our place in the fossil record along with all the other dinosaurs. It takes little or no knowledge of the problems of a society to know one is suffering inequality. Equally, it can be easier to mistakenly identify the problem of a society, unaware of the actual issues. One can misdiagnose these things quite easily. So, to effectively understand the problems faced by society and what one is to do about them, we must first understand how to decode what the problems actually are. I could point to a broken car and simply state that it's broken, but this would give us no idea about what's wrong with the car, what should be corrected, or even at which end of it we should start. It gives us no information about the issue at hand. Even though one knows the car is broken, one can see from its function it's not moving or it's behaving erratically or other to what something like a car was designed to do to begin with. And we can see the same thing in our society as it begins to serve less and less of us in a more sustained way. On a more complex note, it should become obvious from this talk that what is often advertised or reported as the problem from within a society itself is an effort, often deliberate, but in great part also accidental, in misdirection from the actual issues or problematic mechanisms or behaviors. Very often it is the syntax of the social structure, its governing assumed logic of what constitutes value and what has priority that overrides attempts at so-called reform. This has recently been seen with the talks between Germany and the UK, which has seen the UK wishing to protect the UK's banking and debt economy from the reform attempts that would see a curbing of the money production, some bailout issues that might negatively affect the UK economy, as it's mentioned in the newspapers. In other words, the exact problem that has exacerbated collapse and sovereign debt default around the globe, and yet the priority remains the preservation of the dominant established mechanism, and not that which actually matters in real life. More accurately, what is reported in the media to be at issue is what has been allowed to be represented as at issue in the media in the first place. For the structure produced by money, such as the media, must also be powered by money in order to remain dominant in the money society. This talk is an attempt to understand the difference between what is often advertised as the problems or illegal behavior or corruption within our culture, and additionally to redefine and reorder what true corruption is, what is in fact going wrong with the societal mechanisms we collectively refer to as civilization. Here we ask ourselves, what is the nature of corruption? So, point one, corporate corruption. What is corporate corruption, other than loudly proclaimed, bolded headlines and frenetic news cycles, followed by the ritualistic offering up of a CEO or two here and there, who in most cases might not even be directly involved in what's at issue in the story itself? Rarely, I think, do we consider anything beyond the stories that become more of a spectacle themselves. These stories are the spectacle itself, and that becomes the unwitting and invisible scapegoat of the occurrence to begin with. We hate the story and not the game behind it. We hate the images and the consequences and maybe the people, but we don't perceive the underlying schema that gives rise to the pressures that acted upon behaviors and environments that require survival that are required for survival in this system. This, which we are trained to denote as corruption. It's a little reminiscent of the 2-minute hate in George Orwell's 1984, an image to be detested while the source problem goes unnoticed and not analyzed in any way. In fact, were we to ask current received wisdom what corporate corruption is, we might just hear the assertion that it's the product of a small subset of bad and greedy human beings in positions of power and authority within corporate structures, acting selfishly, subverting the rules of the free market game, breaking the law to maximize their own wealth. A few bad apples, separate from society, a subversion of it, contrary to it. Before we try and trace back the original cause of corporate corruption, or what it might indeed mean, we need to address this particular concept. The myth of the innately evil human being is now dead. Original sin is as preposterous as the evidently fictional stories that have been used and invented out in the open to prop up ideas of innate guilt and flawed humanity over the centuries. We now have more advanced, more elegant, and proven explanations reliant on evidence for positive and negative human behaviors and motivations. Interpersonal neurobiology and the work of Simon Baron-Cohen, Robert Sapolsky, and countless others has shown the effect of environment on human behavior. Environment, of course, also includes things like birth defects, brain damage in life, or abuse and neglect by a family or a society at large, as well as the damaging neurobiological after effects of such negative exposures. We now understand that a great deal of antisocial behavior is indeed a reaction to some violent cause in, of, and from society. Antisocial is the correct term, yet its meaning has been forgotten, hasn't it? And instead reversed to be an innate value judgment on the individual, an antisocial person, and not the interplay between human and social organism, which it really is. Further, there exist societies in which corruption of the social fabric is so minor so as to be non-existent. Human behavior isn't uniform worldwide, and it's even almost unrecognizable when extremes are sometimes compared. We are malleable, we are inventive, we are naturally curious. We often strive for improvement of ourselves and our surroundings. It is these elements and factors that are human nature themselves, not any kind of good or evil. Good and evil are instead concepts produced by the cumulative values of the social organism and have always changed along with it. It's not the other way around. So let us therefore phrase this question of corporate corruption a little bit differently. In fact, might the real question be, what does the tendency for corporate corruption actually signify? What is it that goes wrong consistently to produce the systemic effects of corruption? What is actually at fault in these occurrences? How can we explain the effects through a systemic analysis? We see the growing weeds of corruption. Now, where and what are the roots embedded in? I'll try and define what we mean by corporate corruption as a phenomenon divorced from the ravings of the media, especially, funnily enough, actually the independent, non-corporate media, who are much shriller when it comes to the volume and tone of coverage. There is something to be learned from that later, by the way, as we venture on into this question, and we should return to the landscape of this coverage. The independent media are also, of course, signifiers of society. They also play a role in denoting not just the effects, but also the bias behind being able to talk about the effects. So as a society, the pale we don't venture beyond is what the systemic driving forces that create corporate corruption actually are. The question is not who or when, but what is it? It is, in fact, cliché these days to even tut the word Enron when in conversation about the latest collapsing corporate behemoth, be it MF Global a few weeks ago, Lehman Brothers in 2008, WorldCom in 2002, BP's cost-cutting driven, inept and incompetent wholesale destruction of the eastern seaboard of the United States in 2010, or be it something more scary but less well reported, such as the biological terrorism of Bayer and their Factor VIII blood treatment, a blood plasma-based treatment for hemophiliacs sold in the European market while consciously known to be tainted by AIDS virus plasma, known dissemination of a disease for profit. Thus, the refrain is bleated atonally and ad infinitum. I'll throw my hat into the ring about how that's said. Why is it corporate crime goes unpunished, whereas petty crimes or interpersonal behavioral violence of crime is often rapidly punishable with a prison sentence? This is what we answer tonight automatically through an understanding of the causes of these social misfirings. There is a reason why one can wear a white collar and a nice suit and commit economic genocide around the world. and get away with it, or have a suspended sentence. Whereas you do see non-violent drug offenders slammed into the most violent areas of any society, which is its prison system, and that's especially true of the US and parts of the UK as well, most of the UK. There is a reason why that is the preferred operation, why it is that we punish one more readily than the other, and it's inversely proportional to the size of the money involved. Now, just to be clear, I am by no means the first or even the most competent to address or answer this question, but in the great weight of media, in the great gathering up of all the tabloids, broadsheets, video, radio, blogs and sites, it is another singular vote towards root cause explanation, as weighed against the remaining media, or worse, the general silence on the issue by many media organizations. Silence unusually given ironic voice by the substitution of bland entertainment in the place of coverage of a story affecting human welfare. As a short aside, while I live and breathe culture and being a fan of creative writing and music and art and literature, I find it nothing but depressing how much of culture and entertainment is given over not to the digestion or dissemination of social issues, as all the best culture always has been in some sense, but instead to actually stop thinking on these issues, to block out systemically any understanding of the dynamics of the world. Culture like this is in fact the most poisonous of all. Where the mainstream media gets some credit from me is in at least acknowledging that there is some kind of outside world, and that that all may not be ideal, that there is a story. But it's the blandishments and useless fluff of wholly detached entertainment industry, telling increasingly focused on the non-famous random individual person. It's an interesting way in which media has directed itself, is towards reality television, to a random ordinary person. It's not even an unusual person anymore. It's just someone now. And it is reality TV which, in the literal sense, actually gives precisely the most unrealistic insight into our collective life. All it takes for so-called evil to spread is for reality TV to pretend there is no story to begin with. So anyway, to return to the topic at hand, at the core, corporate corruption is a product of a set of market presuppositions inherent in the social fabric we overlook, which we do not see as a construct in itself. Arguments advanced in the mainstream media and even by some of the most advanced thinkers and specialists ends at this level. For to venture more deeply is to risk outlining the hems and threads of the emperor's invisible clothes. One such presupposition is the notion of scarcity. It is no surprise that some of the most powerful, profitable, and strongest advertisers and lobbyists of the corporate landscape are pharmaceutical and drug and food companies. Food and health are necessary human requirements for survival. As more money can be demanded for scarce but required goods such as these, the higher the profit. Simple. And easily witnessed in our culture, be it so-called Western civilization or Eastern civilization. The pattern is very, very similar across the world. Another presupposition inherited from landowner feudal models of old is the concept of external restriction of resources or goods, known commonly by all of us as ownership. To own a process, a good, a land, or even simply own access to anything is also to uphold its scarcity to the population who pose themselves as the source of earnings. Additionally, this action, if set down by law or enacted in a large-scale manner, monopolizes or attempts to monopolize that good or earning potential itself, so that it cannot be used as a benefit by any other party. Hence, in modern-day operations, the power of patent litigation, ownership of ideas, trade secrets and such have spawned entire corporate departments and indeed entire industries of their own to legitimate this dominance through fear of monetary penalization if you don't play the game correctly. Or even the ultimate form of external restriction, prison sentences for not participating or being able to participate in the game of maximization of profit through scarcity. Ideas in this system are not used to help humanity or a society, but to enact a level of dominance over that human being or society. Naturally, there is more money to be made off the continued dissemination of your restricted good or service than the once and for all sale or solution of a problem by a long-term method. As such, it's not profitable to cure a disease or a problem, but to prescribe a course of treatment at great cost and expense, a treatment which can, if possible, not be sold anywhere else. In the particular example of healthcare, the existing laws do attempt in a roundabout way to limit the outright ownership forever of a treatment by one company by imposing a 7-year patent expiration limit on pharmaceuticals once they've been patented, after their discovery, after their design. This includes the time for actually testing the drug as well. Now, what happens next can be seen in the stories of Vioxx and other inadequately tested drugs. Rushing to maximize the legal time limit in which scarcity can be monopolized and maximized for that pharmaceutical company, drug companies inadvertently and inadequately test their products incorrectly, or pay off the FDA or similar authorities for fast-tracking drugs, only to find after mass dissemination that the drugs might be killing the population in many cases. Such fast tracks are not available, of course, to non-corporates, are they? The money dictates this rule all by itself without the need for any legal framework. How does this affect the social organism then? Well, in 2008, a report by the Florida Medical Examiners Commission concluded that prescription drugs had outstripped illegal drugs as a cause of death. An analysis of almost 170,000 autopsies in Florida in 2007 found that 3 times as many people were killed by legal drugs as by cocaine, heroin, and all the methamphetamines put together. According to state law enforcement officials, this is a sign of the burgeoning prescription drug abuse problem. So not only do we have drugs being rushed through that sometimes blow up like Vioxx does, and we have a vast amount of heart attacks and heart problems and strokes and all the rest of it. But of course, because we live in a very stressful society, we're also providing over-the-counter drugs and other so-called legal drugs that are actually now, due to the abuse, killing people quicker than the so-called dangerous and illegal drugs. Of course, if you think about it, the dangerous and illegal drugs pose a direct competition, don't they, to the pharmaceutical industry, even if they might not be as serious as they are, although, of course, in some cases they are. Things like methamphetamine are very serious indeed, but it doesn't take very long to look at the history of, what substances have been banned before to see that the scales are very much tipped in favor of the more dangerous pharmaceuticals and very much away from the less dangerous, marijuana and all the rest of it. What exactly does one expect the effect to be in a game based on scarcity, profit, and monopoly-based ethics? One level of abstraction higher is the industry of money making money off money itself. Try and say that quickly 6 times in a row. Since money is essentially the metrics by which scarcity is measured and leveraged for societal gain, it is therefore possible to turn the model around and sell money to one and all, or even to other institutions. Here the game's rules are even more focused on the gaming strategies and monopolist or cartel behaviors. It may be surprising to the listener, but corporate corruption in this sense is not the exception, but surprisingly the unspoken and unenunciated rule of any society based on the values of power differentiation, the hunting out of advantage, competitive market forces, and indeed money itself. As odd as that may sound, the unaddressed nature of this question also reminds us that we cannot expect such a society to yield media independent enough to be able to speak about wide-ranging systemic effects that are borne out by the cultural value set, which, of course, by default, the media must be upholding to be called that culture's media in the first place. At the real baseline of all this, it needs to be realized that the restriction of life goods for profit and the way in which any corporation is forced by the rules of the game to produce the most inferior and short-lived and even entirely superfluous products and services is the corruption itself, not the lack of adherence to the arbitrary publicly announced rules of that situation. The monetary market model is the problem due to its own rules and its own prerequisites. Its own functions create this. Any notion that this is a new problem, by the way, is quickly disabused when one factors in that the religious institutions of old are, in fact, the prior era's corporations, protecting their inner secrets with codified language, hierarchies, and outward influence, not only on the laws and punishments of society, but also the general values. Now, I hasten to point out in advance that I'm not attacking anyone's faith at this point, much as I do not put my dislike of football down to any individual player. The following is a short digression on the nature and the functions of an organization with an establishment to protect, and it's no reflection on the viability or validity of the individual believer. So, part 2 then is religious corruption. The Catholic Church's apparent immunity from being taken down in relation to its deep involvement in the abuse of young children and cover-up of said abuse is a modern example of the corporate crime immunity reaching back into the religious schema as well. How long would a small company last if such a similar story were to be unveiled? This is equal to corporate immunity that we see in big business or in big pharma. The only difference here in operational terms is that we do not recognize the Catholic Church as a separate establishment entity in the way we look at a company in the marketplace, choosing instead, I'd imagine, to see the church most likely as a distillation of our, or if not someone else's, cultural belief systems and values. We see it really as a byproduct and not a deliberate institution itself. And yet, the mechanism is the same and always has been. Indeed, for an establishment with a particular specialization, monopoly, or perceived vital element not available in any other institution, in order for that to remain extant, it must impose the same forcible mechanisms, the same games of differential advantage, the same corrupt dominance over a population to survive. One has to play by the rules of the game. Doesn't matter if you're peddling a religion, or you say you're peddling a religion, or you happen to be in the pharmaceutical game, or any of the other games that require you to be an establishment to begin with. Now, an easy corollary to that statement is to witness the corporate lobbying by any other name that churches perform to attack laws which might shrink their overall viability within that social system. Or relevance or power over the culture, and enforce and enshrine laws which would help to preserve their status quo to begin with. To invoke Galileo is to invoke the cliché example of this, and it would be old hat were it not for the fact that to this day a Catholic sect is still insisting that the universe is geocentric, still insisting that Galileo is wrong. Never mind the evidence. This cultural presupposition is required to support the outdated prior text that cannot be questioned or updated, because the final and central plank in this particular institution is infallibility. That's the big sell, a notion which itself is invalid in a world still growing and developing according to what we've learned and proven through the scientific method, our technical reality. Thus, we find religious institutions attempting to influence laws on sexual behavior, encroaching on and undermining scientific teaching in schools, to be replaced with unscientific nonsense, which quite literally teaches the wrong subject, religious dogma, in the wrong class, biology, archaeology, and history, and lobbying for direct subsidization by governments as a result of that as well, on top of this. Now, many people might not think that governments subsidize religion, but let's give it its other name that we're allowed to talk about, tax exemption. This is exactly the same thing. So, separation of church and state. Well, as long as you have tax-exempt religions, I don't think you can really claim to have any of that functioning in the real world. Now, as I said, these functions were not a reflection of the believers. Just as individual shareholders cannot necessarily be held responsible for the unnoticed corporate greed which might ultimately sink their own portfolio. Bear in mind also, you have a bank account, and the money that's in your bank account is not at the moment in your bank account. It is being invested somewhere, and you have no idea. You may even be given the opportunity to suggest where you may want it invested, but you don't know that that's actually happening, do you? So bear in mind that this eerie sense that while you have what you think is money in your bank, or in most of our cases debt, I suppose, that money is in fact doing the rounds, backing all kinds of societal mechanisms you may in fact not want to back. For we do see identical behavior in companies like Monsanto to the same basic mechanisms that we see in religion. It is a fascinating company. In a truly religious fashion, it does strive through powerful lobbying and uncircumscribable genetic modification to indeed become literally the master of all it can survey and have dominance over all creatures. Genetic tattooing of organisms makes them automatically owned by the company, much like the mechanism of original sin presupposes the a priori inclusion of any human within the religion claiming the doctrine. And as genetically modified crops are indeed made to be fruitful and multiply right into a neighboring farm, farmers are immediately treated with the original sin of having inadvertently used the property of what one might term the Church of Monsanto, and as such are in debt and must be given absolution, literally in the sense that they are made financially insoluble by the resulting lawsuits or settlements. For thus it was written. This is the mechanism. Or consider the remarkable hybrid of Scientology, a semi-religion, semi-business, with trade secrets, unknowable doctrines, large edifices, and a hell of a legal department to protect their business secrets, as their central, once secret, now entirely downloadable manuals and absurd stories are described by their own powerful legal forces. Many former Amazon.com employees in the States have equally complained that their workplace felt like a cult, very close to a cult. Several people, including a chap called Mike Daisy, have talked about this. But how is this a surprise? Once you've understood that the basis for cooperation is to maximize gain, trap, cheat, and tweak oneself into an ever-growing, established fortress, where all without are either only to be dealt with for one's own gain or are direct all-out enemies, what can one possibly expect? This is exactly what one would expect from such a system. And any reform without eradicating the very foundations of operation is to do nothing but rearrange the deck chairs on the Titanic. As such, we are not dealing with a modern problem, but only modern players of a very old game, with humanity on the losing side against itself. Now, let's also disabuse ourselves up front of the notion, often peddled by the media, that the tendency we are seeing is somehow the result of human nature. This statement is to say precisely nothing at all. The reason we see behavioral and even genetic variants around the world's population is itself a testament that humanity are themselves agents as well as products of change and adaptation. Partly physical, giving rise to what we still laughably refer to as different races. Partly cultural, in, for example, the average demeanor and associations of a Chinese person or an Englishman, or indeed what we ultimately all are traceable to, an African heritage. Thus, to say that any particular behavior is human nature is simply to ascribe said behavior to something within a malleable set of possible human actions based on environmental factors and pre-existing cultural norms. It doesn't say anything. These influences can be seen on several levels. To make this clear, take the physical attributes of a member of the Chinese community or a Caucasian community or whatever. Various factors of environment and selection and, genetic history and environmental history have rendered several outward features that we can identify and group together. And those have come about through that mechanism, through a sort of selection process, a refining process. Similarly, on a shorter time scale and more generally, and not in this sense biologically really, the cultural values and associations of thought and behavior within any particular person are an extended byproduct of what has come to be valued or seen as useful for survival or acceptable behavior over perhaps hundreds of years within a particular culture. Here it is the folkways, the traditions, usually several generations in length at least, that are forging the environment that forms some of the behavior of the individual of a particular culture or even a sub-community. One can, for example, restrict this particular heritage down to a particular village and still see a distinction in behavior and trends and cultural norms from even right outside that village. Think about some of the ways in which the Cornish villages are known for extraordinary, extravagant festivals every year. As these old traditions get refined down and down, or for a comic example, think about Bill and Ted, where they do their guitar move, that and and then they travel into the future, and it's sort of distilled down to this very remarkable and very odd kind of behavior that these people are now doing. That's almost what everything that we do is. It's a distillation of sort of prior cultural norms based on the precepts of something that has existed before. So that's a smaller level. And yet, on a more microcosmic level, with the CEOs and executives involved with so-called white-collar crime and this corporate corruption, we are seeing an even shorter distillation of value sets, ones that are put in place within one lifetime, or a portion of a lifetime, more accurately. After all, no baby is born with the mindset or values of a CEO. And the very name white-collar crime itself denotes that we implicitly understand as a society that a certain portion of class or society is being subdivided and denoted, here indicated by a class association of clothing. So, exposed to the particularly pronounced values and environmental constructs of the corporate world's upper circles, this tendency to white-collar crime, discounting of environmental effects, and the value of profit over all other contingencies is not then down to unique attributes outside of the, quote, normal operation, but are a tendency within the operation itself, as are the traditions of a village or the cultural landscape, which is simply assumed by that culture to be its operating baseline, not itself a construct as well. And thus, again, we realize the basic truth about all of this. Corporate crime goes unpunished and in a great many cases is essentially rewarding because it in fact is in line with the real rules of the game. The necessary behavior, the actual operation that an entity needs to take part in order to survive in that society, in order to even be recognized as valid in that society, in order to stand the best chance of avoiding competition in that society. The very reason that super rich may receive a suspended sentence or useless and unenforced penalties for real environmental destruction, like what happened with the Exxon Valdez, this is because this is the reward system of the now. Sorry, it is. So the next time you find yourself yelling at the news about the latest, bitter environmental destruction or corporate, money-based crime, remember Orwell's 2-minute hate that you're now acting out. Remember the implicit rule system that we all support. Remember that you are shouting at a box that will break down early and that is essentially pumping into your living room the values that you require to go on not questioning everything around you with the real cultural values that might help you overcome it, that might help you understand it, that might help you decode what it is that's actually wrong. And so here we come to where the argument for real change is failing, except in a few tiny areas. You do not change anything until you eradicate the monetary market model's functions. The basic logic of the system now is the corruption that has emerged. Through its necessary magnification of debt on more debt, money on more money, poverty giving rise to greater poverty as people are born into their Monsanto-like or original sin-like predetermined positions of suffering and marginalization and bitter antisocial senses. in greater debt, in a society with an ever more caustic version of the game of divide and conquer being enacted out for every new generation or every new subgeneration. And until we demand, as a globe, as humanity itself, not as countries, those are also invented, those are also structures that behave very much like companies. You know, you have to be on side, right, with something. That doesn't exist anymore. Until we demand that information be open, that cooperation should truly exist, and that this shared life of ours is meant to be a wonderful adventure, as Chaplin put it in The Great Dictator, not a free-for-all destructive game of necessary violence. Until then, you change nothing at all. Unfortunately, the understanding that the effects of money and market doctrine are necessarily detrimental in their culminated form is not understood by almost everyone. At best, people throw their hands up and say, "Oh, banking, well, it's beyond me, mate." I heard this rhetoric on near Waterloo, right by the Thames. There was a firework display a couple of weeks ago, and some gentleman in a very familiar mask, Guy Fawkes mask, was, trying to hand this money out, trying to hand information out regarding the banking system, and this gentleman just threw his hands up and said, "Well, it was beyond him. He's not able to decode it." Well, we all know that that's not true. But, what happens when you say that? Banking, it's beyond me. Well, then you live the life of an oblivious slave. Or at worst, we see the transitions from one state of dictatorship to a military dictatorship in the interim, as we've done in the Middle Eastern countries subsumed in the Arab Spring. When a society doesn't know what the right thing is to back, the worst form of coercion takes over and forces that society back into its detrimental, owned presuppositions of gain and all the rest of it. It is forced back onto the rails if people don't know the right thing to ask for. Protesters everywhere are not going to achieve anything until the culture comes to realize its own implicit value set, recognize its own disease, identify the illness at work. It takes bravery to challenge the real status quo, not just what is allowed to be defined as the status quo. The real status quo is always going to feel like a taboo. A civilization based on intelligently managing and fairly distributing the planetary life goods with a view to maximum quality of life presupposes an end to divisions, gain, profit for profit's sake, the violence of differing equality or quality of treatment of others. It presupposes the absence of the corruption we're so baffled by and that we condemn so loudly whilst playing the game significantly and deliberately. It presupposes the value of life capital above corporate immunity. It tells us what is valuable based on what humanity requires. And of course, humanity requires a strong environment. So automatically you have earth rights built into it as well. In summary then, we call for a new enlightenment. We call for a real evolution in the zeitgeist. For once we realize that we can technologically build the kind of life for all on this planet that would make the so-called super rich of today's ragged and makeshift civilization gawk till their jaws drop at the quality of life actually possible, once we realize that we can support the now 7 billion on this planet and more, knowing this, to be human and call ourselves human, and consider ourselves human, we must enact it or lose our humanity in the absence of action. Thank you for listening, and good night.